Hello friends, for today's video I'm going to be tier ranking all the new fantasy, romance, and romantasy books that I picked up in 2025. I did do this same style of video for all the new fantasy releases that I picked up last year, so I'll have that linked in case that's more so what you're looking for. Part of the reason that I wanted to have these be separate is because I do think that these genres are separate enough at this point that there are different expectations for when you pick them up. I do still tend to gravitate and prefer fantasy over fantasy romance, but typically how I approach tier rankings is that I am ranking the books within one given tier ranking against each other, not books of all time, because otherwise some of the tier rankings that I would do would have nothing in the top tiers or nothing in the bottom tiers. Rather, I have a decent amount of books to pull from, and then we're kind of looking at a tier ranking of them against each other, which is just kind of a nicer way of saying that if I were to have combined these, none of these would end up in the top tier. I do have more of a preference for those. However, I did still have quite a number of books that were fantasy, romance, and romantasy that I quite liked in 2025. There were a number that kind of just sat in the middle, so we'll obviously explore all of that today. But all that said, let's go ahead and jump into it. I am going to go through these relatively fast in the tier ranking. I am not ranking everything within each individual tier, so there's no order within each individual tier, they're just there. And then also, because I'm going to be going through these relatively quickly, if you're interested in more in-depth thoughts, I'll have any reviews that I did for these in the description bar down below. With tier 3, we'll go ahead and start in the middle because I always like to start with the middle and then work our way to the extremes. So tier 3, for this first one, we have As Many Souls as Stars. I thought that this book, I understood the comparisons to some of V.E. Schwab's works. It did in some ways feel like if you mixed Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil as well as Addie LaRue. I think Addie LaRue was more formally used in the marketing of this as a comp title. And I definitely can see the comparisons both in the writing itself and how we explored the character's life. However, I think the downside to having a comp title for a book that is pretty, even though there are some, of course, criticisms and whatnot of both of the ones I mentioned by V.E. Schwab, but more so talking about Addie LaRue, even though certainly there are criticisms of it, V.E. Schwab's kind of a powerhouse in the genre, and for a lot of people, for good reason. If you're going to use that as a comp title, even if it's accurate, you have to be careful because you are kind of inviting people to consistently compare those things, or you have that in the back of your mind. And I do feel like that was true for me, where I enjoyed aspects of As Many Souls as Stars, but I do ultimately feel like it was highlighting for me, that comp title was highlighting for me how much I preferred Addie LaRue and also Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab over this. I do think, though, that, if I'm not mistaken, this might have been this author's debut, or at the very least it was their fantasy, romance, romantasy debut, and I quite liked it when especially it comes to how it changes a lot of what we've seen in the genre. So it did subvert some expectations. If you don't know anything about this one, you are following this character who, in her life, you are kind of exploring her over the course of different settings, I'll say. And throughout these different settings, you have this force, this being that's kind of almost this demonic entity that is sort of obsessed with them. And it isn't, I don't think, even trying to present itself as romantic or beautiful. I think it's sort of this obsessive examination. And I thought how it approached everything was quite unique. And that's where, of course, you can see some of the comparisons to Addie LaRue. But I think Addie LaRue is not a fantasy, romance, or romantasy, and some people were hoping it would be. And if that was you, if you were like, oh, I kind of wanted that to be a little bit more of an emphasis in the story, As Many Souls as Stars might end up working for you. I liked it. I thought it was pretty well written. I liked some of the thematic pieces of this. It was a little different from a lot of the other ones I picked up. The Scorpion and the Night Blossom. So this is one that, when I was first starting it, I was like, oh, this feels kind of the opposite of what I was saying about As Many Souls as Stars. At first, I was like, this feels so similar to so many things we've seen before. The characters, how they interact, how they talk to each other. But I feel like the author kind of pulls you in with a lot of familiarity and then allowed for you to be surprised later because you thought, you were kind of falsely thinking, oh, I've seen this all before. And then we kind of had some things happen that were a little different. It was still, at the end of the day, quite tropey, though. But it was really, really fun. I think that at the end of the day, it was just like a great Friday night. I just want to stay up and read a book kind of a feeling. Similar to, I think sometimes there are certain kinds of movies that you sit and you contemplate and you think when you watch them. And then there are some movies that you're like, I just kind of want to have a good time and enjoy myself. And I think that Scorpion and the Night Blossom more so leaned into that territory. Because when I first finished it, I was like, it's not exactly 100% my tastes. But it was still quite fun, and I wasn't sure if I was going to keep going the series, but I was like, I did have fun with that. You know, I did have fun. So I do plan to pick up the sequel when it comes out. We also have Of Flame and Fury. I personally wouldn't consider this one romantasy or fantasy romance. There is a romantic subplot, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think this one was, the comp titles were Iron Widow and Fourth Wing, and I don't know that I think either of those were necessarily accurate. The only reason I think it had Iron Widow, if I'm remembering correctly, is because there is more of a modern feel to this. It's not medieval fantasy or anything like that. There are characters who are a part of these races, and there's like an evil corporation kind of a feel to it. And this corporation, in order for them to get by, they have to accept this sponsorship deal for them because they are a part of this dangerous racing, specifically with phoenixes, in order to ensure that they can still look after the bond that they have. They don't want to abandon that, but they need the money, and so they accept the money from this corporation. But then you're like, but would it have been better if they had tried to scrape by, but they didn't have any options otherwise, so what could they have done? And I do think that the stakes are a lot of fun in that way. Again, there is a romantic subplot, but I don't really think that was the emphasis of it. But again, the modern parts of it are where I think maybe the Iron Widow comparison came in. The Fourth Wing one, maybe just because there's a bond, sort of, with the mythological creature, but I still don't really think they were that similar, and I only am putting it here because it was marketed as such, and so I thought it made more sense to include it in this section. But when I read it, I was like, oh, that was a fun time. It was a little different from a lot of the fantasy I've picked up, because again, I would consider it more fantasy than fantasy romance, so I don't want to say it's different from the fantasy romance I've picked up, because of course it is. I don't even think it's really fantasy romance. But it also was a little different from YA fantasy I've picked up. Just in general, it had aspects to it that felt almost like it was speaking to a different era of fantasy, back when we were having more almost dystopian works as the prevalent subgenre. It's not exactly fun in the same way as Scorpion and the Night Blossom. That one I feel like was more popcorn. But they both had that feeling to them. The other one was more like popcorn drama, and this one was more, I feel like, action drama. And I did have fun with both of these. And then last we have Watermoon. Watermoon, I have no problem admitting, I do think I have some positive bias towards this story, because it feels, in my opinion anyway, like it is wearing its Ghibli inspirations on its sleeve, and I'm a big fan of that studio. So anything that reminds me of that, I do tend to think toward it positively. But realistically, if I'm like kind of taking a step back and I'm trying to remove my Ghibli goggles, I'll call them, I don't know that I was totally enamored with this story. I don't know if I thought it was the most beautifully written, or had the most compelling of plots, or the most interesting of world building. I enjoyed it. I didn't love it, but like I said, I recognize that I have some bias toward this one. I think I just wanted a little bit more out of our characters, just a little bit, have just a tiny bit more depth to them. And I think some of the focus on telling their stories and examining their trauma would have made how everything came together, I think, for me anyway, more impactful and maybe even more beautiful in the end. But it was still, it kind of had this Spirited Away and Alice in Wonderland feeling to it, and I don't think we get as much of that in fantasy these days, so it was just kind of nice to be along for the almost nonsensical ride. The ones that were in tier 4, I'll go through these ones relatively quickly. We have the Enchanted Greenhouse. I quite liked the Spell Shop by the same author. This one, for me, just leaned a little too cute, a little too cozy. It was still darling, but ultimately I wanted it to have a little bit more of some of the other emotions besides just like the aw, precious feeling. I wanted it to have a little bit of something else to pull me in, and it didn't have that as much. It was very lush and beautiful and creative, but it was just a little too cotton candy cute for me. We also have the Nightblood Prince. I actually was quite invested in the first half, I would say, of this story. And then in the second half, I thought it actually started to get tropier. It was almost like the reverse of The Scorpion and the Night Blossom, which I thought started incredibly tropey, and then it kind of did something fun with it. Whereas this one I thought was doing something that was maybe more impactful, and I was actually kind of really invested in the character. And then I ended up retracting, I guess you could say, and not being as invested as the story went, and it felt like it was like sliding more into the trendy types of things we see in the genre quite often, and I didn't really buy into some of the characters, and especially some of the relationships that were developing. It started to just feel like things were kind of going slower and were a little bit more serious at the beginning with some of the plot points and getting to know the characters and understanding why the decisions they're making are so difficult. And then in the second half, it was kind of just like things started to feel a little bit more rushed. And ultimately, I came away from it being like, that didn't quite work for me. We also have The Night and the Moth. I've talked about this one quite a lot. This one I always say, it would pull me in, and then I would get pulled out of it, and then I'd get pulled in, and I'd get pulled out of it. And I felt like conceptually everything was quite cool. And I liked the idea of the world, and I liked the aesthetic, you could say. But I think for me, it kind of always sat in just being that. I'm not accusing the book of only caring about vibes or anything like that, but that's all it ended up kind of being for me. And I'm not somebody who typically can get by with just the vibes of it all. I wanted to care more about these characters, or I wanted to hear more about the lore and be like, wow, that's fascinating. What's going to happen next? And instead I was kind of like, oh, now we're here in this place and it's going to play out like this. And it was kind of predictable. And then the ending, I was kind of like, this felt a little, I mean, I know we foreshadowed this, but it felt a little forced at the same time. And I just didn't end up loving it as much as I feel like it seems everyone else did. We also have Warrior, Princess, Assassin. I actually think when it comes to fantasy romance, the kind of fantasy books where the romance is a big emphasis in the story, and maybe some of the more explicit content is actually being intentionally and thoughtfully used to showcase aspects of the characters, their lives, the trauma they've endured. I think this book did that really, really well, and I also thought quite often the characters behaved realistically. Even when it was frustrating, I was like, well, technically that is kind of a realistic response. However, for me personally, I'm just not as typically invested in the more explicit, heavy types of love stories. I think I like the plot to be less focused on that, which is the risk I run when I pick up fantasy romance and romantasy, because I know that is kind of the focus of a lot of the books in the genre. But I like when there is that, I would say, more 50-50 balance, or maybe like 60-40 in either direction. When it's more of that, when it starts to be like a huge part of it is this tension that's developing, this sexual tension that's developing, and then you have a number of scenes that are like that. Even when it's done well, it's still not exactly what I'm wanting. So I think if I were to rank this based off of what I think, quote unquote, objectively it belongs in, which I don't actually think, I think it's impossible to have that. But I do think as far as how it was done, I thought how it was done was better maybe than even some of the stuff I have in the higher tiers. It was just, for me personally, it wasn't as strong. I would, though, if for some reason there was ever something where it's like, no, you have to read the sequel, you really have to read the sequel, I would by no means be opposed to it. I would still try the sequel out and see what I thought of it, but I'm not currently planning to. I just have so many other books on my TBR, but I definitely didn't hate this one. Isle in the Silver Sea. This is another one that I really wish I'd liked more. The idea of this and the themes of this I thought were great. This is the second book I have tried by this author, and neither of works. This is actually, some of my feelings for it might be similar to The Night and the Moth, in that I tried something else by the author as well, and it didn't quite click. And it could just be that maybe the author's writing styles and how they choose to write not only their plots, but their characters and how the character relationships are built, maybe just how they approach it isn't necessarily, it's not connecting with how I tend to get invested in characters. But The Isle in the Silver Sea, thematically, I thought was really cool. There is this idea of people are almost destined to fulfill certain stories over and over again. And there are these stories that exist, and then it feels like every generation, there are going to be these people that appear that if they fulfill the role of these stories, then they are going to have their fates play out a certain way, whether they like are not based off of what has existed before. And you're kind of looking at characters trying to break out of that. But then thematically, it's almost looking at how we break out of cycles of trauma, cycles of abuse, generational trauma. Like, how do you break out of these systems? And also there's like this idea of co-opting other stories for your own use, and then how they get diluted and you kind of force people into certain boxes. And I thought thematically it was really, really great. But I wasn't invested in the love story basically at all. And that was a pretty central focus of how we were having this story all tied together. And so it was like, I liked everything on the outside, but the thing connecting it all, it didn't quite connect it in the way that spoke to me, if you will. And thus it just kind of didn't work. Also the world building, because of the nature of like, oh, we're fulfilling these stories. Some of the world building was a little bit all over the place. So sometimes characters would talk in a way that was incredibly modern, but then they would have knights and things like that where it just felt really strange. And I don't know that it was expanded upon in a way that I quite liked, even though I know that wasn't necessarily the point. I just kind of had wished the world building was done slightly differently. Moving now into tier 5, so we're kind of going, I liked these a little bit less. We have Soulgazer and Soul of Shadow. Soulgazer, I can say similar things about it to what I said with the Nightblood Prince, where when it first started, I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. The writing is a little... It's almost heady, like you don't entirely have your feet on the ground. You're kind of invited to pay a little bit closer attention to what's going on. And then it went from that to just being quite tropey. And with the Nightblood Prince, I talked about how, even though this is an approximation, I would say roughly the first half felt like that. Second half felt like tropier. This one, it was really just the beginning that I was kind of pulled in by. And then everything else, I was like, oh, this feels very familiar to a lot of what I've seen. So it ultimately... It just kind of, it fell a little flat for me, but I can see this one being quite fun for a number of other readers, especially if you like kind of like the seafaring adventure type of stories, then this one probably will be really fun for you. Soul of Shadow. Okay, Soul of Shadow, I think I described it in the past as feeling like a CW show. That, if you don't know what the CW is, it was this channel and it produced certain... if you know what it is, you know what I'm talking about. It produced a certain kind of show that tended to have just a pretty high level of camp. Characters would speak in a certain way that was dramatic. It wasn't quite soap opera level, but it was also kind of leaning into that territory. And there is something to be said of that style and the fun of it all. It is just not the style for me. And I felt like this story was kind of fitting within that. Jumping now to tier 2. I only have 2 in this tier, which would be Compendium of Lost Tales. I definitely liked the first book in this series the most, so I think there is a level of just being kind of bummed out that the second and third books I didn't love as much as the first one, but I still overall quite like this. Do I consider it fantasy romance or romantasy? Not necessarily. I don't know, because I don't really think that the focus of the story is the love story. I recognize there is a subplot, but this feels like one of those books that could go either direction. I might lean more toward fantasy, and the reason I'm bringing this up is just to say I think that's part of why I like it so much, is because of the fantasy elements having a little bit more of an emphasis. And I actually do quite like, though, the romance in this story. I do like these two characters. I like how different they are from each other, and I think that they work quite well. They definitely have similar feelings to Hal and Sophie from Howl's Moving Castle, to bring Studio Ghibli back up, where one of them is a little more studious and focused, and the other one is eccentric and fabulous. So I do like the dynamic between the characters. I like the approach to the Fae. I like this more academic way of researching the Fae, but this third one was just not quite as high up for me as the first 2. And then the other one I have in this tier would be Immortal. This is a standalone, and I just really like the way that this author describes her worlds. They're always so lush and vibrant, and they just feel and seem so beautiful. And there's something about getting kind of lost in this fantasy world. That's part of why I think a lot of us love fantasy, is because of the creativity that you can transport us to this place that you have in your own mind. You can allow us to go into it as well, and you can do anything you want with it. And it feels like this author has a way of doing that, where it's like, wow, this is so beautiful. Why are other books like this? Why aren't we utilizing the genre like this more often? I don't know that I was as in love with the plot and the love story necessarily as maybe I would be in my all-time favorites, but I still thought it was fun, and I enjoyed the kind of drama of it all and the star-crossed lovers feel to it, and I definitely think that this author is quite good at writing stories in that fashion. I think I have yet to... I think maybe the book that is really for me by this author has yet to be written, because I think I will always enjoy, more than likely, the stories this author writes, but I think if there's going to be one that I really, really love, it might maybe need to be a little more epic. I think this author can do it, too. I think they could do it really well because of how great their world building is. So I think it's possible, but some of their books do tend to lean into some familiar territory, which is why I think I'm not as personally invested in some of it, is because it plays out in similar ways to things I've seen before. But I think that if they really utilize what I feel are their strengths, and then they couple that with maybe having some uniqueness and their creativity in the world building, if they apply that to their characters and the relationship building, maybe that could be a recipe for a fantastic one that fits my taste personally. I know that this author has written books that fit other people's tastes, so I'm just talking specifically, selfishly, for me. I'll do my one book that is in the bottom tier. If you saw my worst books of 2025, then you'll already probably know this, but Spellcaster, this one to me was like if you took the dragons out of Fourth Wing, is how I described it. And the dragons were kind of the only thing I liked about Fourth Wing, so if you took the dragons out, it's kind of this book. And I don't know that I need to elaborate too much more. The writing style is very, very young, and it's a little more modern than I prefer. It is high drama, pretty much constantly. The relationship building is not at all my cup of tea. It just really didn't work at all. But then the ones that I did quite enjoy. So for the top tier, we have A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping. When it comes to cozy fantasy, we're 2 for 2 with this author. I do quite enjoy how they write it. This one maybe leaned a little bit more into being extra eccentric for some of the side characters, and I think maybe if we toned it down just the tiniest bit, maybe I would have liked it even more, but this is being very, very specific here. I still thought it was a lot of fun, extremely heartwarming. I liked the characters. I liked the way the story played out. I quite liked this one. We also have In the Veins of the Drowning. I just had, from start to finish, a great time with this story. I enjoyed the characters, I enjoyed the stakes, I enjoyed the sense of adventure. I actually did quite like the couple in this story. I wouldn't say it's groundbreaking necessarily, but I also don't think it's quite as familiar as a lot of the romantasy and fantasy romance we've gotten so far. And then last for today, I'm kind of like, was this my favorite one of all of these? And it might have been. And that would be The God and the Gwisin. This is the sequel to The God and the Gamiho. The God and the Gwisin really embraced the stupid from the first book in the best of ways. So the first book is campy, it is over the top, and it is sometimes really dumb, but playfully stupid, you know, where it's like it knows it and it's leaning into it and it's making fun of itself, and it has some low-hanging fruit jokes, and it has jokes that are kind of punny, and then it has jokes that are kind of clever, and then it has just ridiculous shenanigans that are happening, and I was so entertained. It was, I described it before as, for those of you that have watched Spy Family, which I know is not going to be for everyone, but there's an arc in Spy Family where they're on this cruise ship, which there is a cruise ship basically as the setting for The God and the Gwisin. But there's a part where Lloyd, who's normally very cool, calm, and collected, he's trying a little too hard to do a good job at his mission of being a cool, relaxed dad. And he just puts on the most ridiculous touristy outfit in his efforts to make his adopted daughter Anya think he's cool. And by trying so hard to be really cool, he looks absolutely ridiculous and stupid. And it's just funny and dumb. And I feel like that feeling of that moment and that arc is what this whole book kind of felt like. Like the whole thing was so nonsensical, but in the best of ways. Not nonsensical in that nothing made sense, but I just mean it was just having so much fun, and I don't think it was trying too hard to be really serious. But then on occasion there would be references to real world kind of issues and trauma that a lot of people have endured. And it was kind of endearing. I just thought it really embraced what it was in a way that I also found quite entertaining. So I did very much enjoy that one. But that is my tier ranking of the new fantasy romance and romantasy books that I picked up in 2025. Let me know if you also were picking up books from this genre. Which ones really worked for you? Did you pick up any of the ones that I picked up? Where do you most agree? Where do you most disagree? Just in general, what are your thoughts? But thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.